hello. Alright, people. I need to figure out what's going on. I forgot to switch the name of the stream. It still says Wintervale Whimsy because, well, you know. Thinking's hard. We're gonna call this episode 10. We are Orc. Part 1. So being that it's part 1, you guys should probably get the inclination already that this is going to be a multi-part series. We're going to talk about the best race in the entire freaking game, aside from, you know, my wife's favorite, Torn, the Orcs. Everyone knows me, that, or anyone who has known me for a long period of time has known that I've always preferred to be an Orc. Whether it's Mag Horror or not, Orcs have always been my fallback, my go-to since Burning Crusade. I was an Orc, let's see, I was a undead rogue through vanilla. Switched to Torn Shaman about halfway through. Once Molten Core dropped, we realized we didn't have healers back when we needed 40 people to do so. That's kind of turned into when BC hit. Well, actually, right at the end of vanilla, we were talking about going into a regular raiding direction then. And I remember saying, well, we don't have tanks because the guild that we left had the tanks with it. So that's when my first Orc became a reality. His name was Rocktar. I still have him. I still have him to this day. Dude's 17 years old. It's man, that's a way to think about it, isn't it? But how much, I mean, aside from the people who have been playing for a long time, they've kind of seen the Orcs grow with the game. But who knows that much about them aside from what you really see in the beginning trial quest, and then you stop paying attention because you're too busy trying to level as fast as possible, right? So let's see. I'm trying to pull up. But what I want to do while I'm doing this, what I want to do is kind of have a multi-part series to talk about the Orcs, their not only general lore, but really deep dive into them, really get into the things not a lot of folks know about them. You know what I'm saying? Like we always hear the big names. We hear Ner'zhul, we hear Thrall, we hear, you know, Gul'dan, we hear Garrosh, we hear Grommash, but Arkham Doomhammer, we hear these names, but what do we know about most of them, and what play, you know, what parts do they play in each facet of the game? Durotan obviously being Thrall's dad, but what's Durotan's huge story? Where does he come from? Let's explore those things. You know what I'm saying? Let's do it together, because it's, as much as I say I like to know about the game, I know a dang decent amount. Sure. But do I know everything? Absolutely not. The Orcs being, you know, big and powerful, they definitely hold their place. So just to give everyone an idea of who my guy is, I'll show you. This way. That's my dude Ziggy. He is my newest, should I say, my warrior. He's obviously Revendreth, but that's, I mean, he's my most comfortable. If you see this dude run around in Emerald Dream with one of many transmogs, my biggest giveaway about who I am when I'm playing this game is my mini Diablo. Right there. I have him everywhere I go. For every boss drop, for every old instance ran. That's my dude. But yeah, back to the show, right? Alright, let's go. talking orcs, right? Let's start with a real generalization, okay? And I just want to do this for this first episode. We know a bit, at least we all like to think we know a bit about them, right? But do we? So in general, like for example, like they have their own Orcish language. They have the different races they can play. We know that the Maghars are the purified ones that didn't. Well, that's the other thing. Who knows how the Maghar really came to be? And of course, Overwatch had to download an update while we're trying to stream because we know why not throw the why not send the packets to hell? Thanks a lot. Take 3. But anyway, so yeah, we have the orcs, you know, they have Orcish, they have, so how the Maghar whole came to be is because of where the orcs went in their previous lives, in their entirety of their history, right? The orcs are like this huge, prolific, and these monstrously powerful dudes, or dudettes, whichever, that they kind of come from the place that we all knew firsthand in Burning Crusade, the once lush world of Draenor. Yeah, we've all heard the word Draenor. We all know it's a planet. We've all been there. But now it's kind of known as the Outland because of the things that happened due to the orcs that kind of bled the land of its life. Originally, they are a shamanistic people. They kind of have a clan-based society. We hear all these clan names. We know that they're shaman-based because we know they're huge in touch respect for the elements, you know, the fire and the wind and the air and the water, and they use that as their faith. It's a big base of faith for them because they are primarily hunters, gatherers, and a relatively, I mean, at least back then, a relatively peaceful people. The orcs were corrupted at some point, though, by Kil'jaeden. Kil'jaeden's a demon. Yes, in let's see, how do we put Kil'jaeden in a way that most people would understand? He's kind of the devil to the rest of the Titans. Like you got the Titans, and you got the gods, and you got the old gods, and you got all the good guys, and then there's Kil'jaeden. Same in the same vein as Archimonde, has the same vein as Sargeras, yeah. So he is a demon he's like the lord of the Burning Legion, and he manipulated, you know, into forming this bloodthirsty horde that waged war on the peaceful race that also inhabited Draenor, which is where they're named for, is the Draenei. Believe it or not, the Draenei are just as old as the orcs, and as far as the game is concerned, as far as the story is concerned. The orcs were, you know, kind of brought up to this rampant demonic corruption that caused the orcs to be filled with this bloodlust, and that's what turned their skin green. It was that corruption that made their brown skin flake off, and you see the fel that was coursing through them show up in their pigment of their skin. Kind of culminating with the servants of Gul'dan, he kind of convinced the orc chieftains through Kil'jaeden's advice to drink the blood of another demon, Manoroth. He is, I'm trying to think of who we would know. Any of the pit lords is kind of like a smaller version of Manoroth. When they drank the blood, they enslaved themselves to the Burning Legion's will. The few orcs that escaped this corruption, and those are the ones that became as known as the Maghar, which is Orcish for uncorrupted. Now, when we talk about Horde back then, right, that's the old Horde. That was during the time of existence simply as the Horde, or in the earliest games of Warcraft, the Orcish Horde, or the Orc Horde, which is the nickname given to them from the Horde from the beginning of the First War, until it was defeated by the Alliance of Lordaeron at the end of the Second War. That's when the Horde kind of broke and became a refolding into what we know it is today. It's also used to differentiate, you know, the word Old Horde from New Horde, because the New Horde was founded by Thrall after the Old Horde's defeat. The fundamental principles of the Old Horde include demon worship, the consumption of blood, or demon blood to become stronger, this merciless killing aspect that they had, this mentality that, merciless killing in warfare, and then the victory in combat to prove one's worth. Those were all old school ways of thinking. Their ranks consisted mostly only of orcs. Sometimes joined, I think they're joined by ogres later on, but they were only the ogres from Draenor, and then later by the forest trolls and goblins from Azeroth. The Horde itself began when Kil'jaeden discovered Draenor to be refuge of Velen and the Draenei, and Kil'jaeden kind of hoped to extract his vengeance for Velen, the prophet, for rejecting Sargeras's offer on Argus, because that's their planet. When Kil'jaeden approached the Orc Elder Shaman, we known him as Ner'zhul, and at the time it was happening, Ner'zhul was like the OG Shaman, wisest, most in touch with the elements that there was. He kind of had a apprentice that we call Gul'dan, posing as a spirit of his deceased, life mate, Rul Khan. Kil'jaeden convinced Ner'zhul. So Kil'jaeden changed his form to make Ner'zhul think that he was his old life mate. So of course the guy was like, okay, which wasn't uncommon to interact with those loved ones of yours in the past in the shamanistic ways. So once he convinced him that the Draenei were plotted against the orcs, and that by stopping them he'd come into this great unstoppable power, Ner'zhul soon had the orc clans attacking Draenei villages, and their entire intent was saving themselves. After completely conquering Draenor, the Horde invaded the world of Azeroth through the dark portal that we've all known so well, and waged war upon the world's native kingdoms until Azeroth's nations, and that's the planet that we're currently calling home, aside from this expansion where we're all dead, but in the Azeroth's nations united into the Alliance of Lordaeron, they managed to defeat the invaders and enslave most of their survivors. Yet the shamanistic tradition of the orcs kind of managed to almost rekindle right from the ashes like a phoenix. But that young shaman, the young shaman that rose from that, was not only green-skinned but blue-eyed, and he was also the son of Durotan and Draka from the original Frostwolf clan that came over the dark portal. We call him Thrall. Birth name being Goel, but Thrall was given by Admiral Blackhand, who ended up raising him, but that's much later. So Thrall rose, let's just skip ahead. Thrall rose to become war chief of the new Horde, right? He kind of led his people into their darkest hour, and he reunited these clans into this new horde that led the orcs out of the eastern kingdoms that they'd been forced to invade and into the continent of Kalimdor. So Thrall took it upon himself to say, okay, yes, we invaded this land, we've been defeated, but this isn't the place for us. This is the entire planet. This is the only part we've seen has been war. There's got to be other places we can settle. So they went to Kalimdor. And then their newfound members of the races of the Horde, they found the nation over in Durotar, and which this is an entire zone now. And that is where the birthplace of Orgrimmar came to be. And Orgrimmar has been the central hub of the orc community since the end of the Third War. The city itself was founded by Thrall and named after his friend and mentor, who was also a former war chief, Ogrim Doomhammer. So you see how this is all starting to come into play. Orgrimmar itself is kind of this fortified complex, right? With these huge, stout walls, these gigantic gates, these super tall towers. It's got a very bold presence to it. Even the first time you come into it, cross its gates in the game, you'll never forget. It's one of those things you finally make it to the hub city and you're just like, whoa, okay, this is some serious shit. The mountain ranges of the northern Durotar is almost like a natural barrier, and it follows all the way through to the back of Orgrimmar. Even some of the Orgrimmar itself is carved into the mountain itself. So as time passed, conflicts between the Alliance and the Horde started to reemerge. During the Cataclysm, right, Thrall passed leadership to the Horde's reckless Garrosh Hellscream. Now, a lot of people... Okay, I'm going to address this here now. A lot of people can't stand the fact Garrosh Hellscream was given a war chief. A lot of people think Garrosh was this horrible, tyrannical leader. Think about this for a second. Thrall was basically taken in and raised, though as a gladiator, raised by humans. He got to observe their culture. He got to observe their ways of life, how they communicate, how they live amongst one another. He was a very humanized orc, right? Bringing that whole new mindset to the old horde, or to the new horde, should I say. A lot of them had the old way of thinking, but there was never really a leader for it, because Thrall had this gigantic vision of how we can all live symbiotically, you know, on the planet itself. When you give the mantle of war chief to an orc like Garrosh Hellscream, who was raised much more traditionally, with a temper and something to prove, in my opinion, until he got corrupted by the Shah, until he got turned, Garrosh Hellscream, still, as much as a Thrall fanboy as people know me to be, Garrosh Hellscream is still probably my favorite war chief we've had, because he runs it with the simple ideals of honor, defense, like never back down from a fight. If you're going to be opposed, you destroy them. You know, he's got it's a very orc mentality. So people get mad because, you know, they say he got corrupted, he was an a-hole, he was this, he was that. But I don't know, man. There's just something about Garrosh Hellscream that makes you like, okay, now that dude's war chief, he's not taking any crap. Okay, so Garrosh is got off topic there. Garrosh's actions, right? He kind of plunged the horde into a civil war, because he had the mentality of the orcish horde is of orcs. And after being deposed, Hellscream traveled to an alternate Draenor in the time for the horde's invasion of Azeroth. This is where Warlords of Draenor took place. There, he kind of rallied the orc clans into this Iron Horde, right? All the orcs formed the Iron Horde, free of demonic corruption, but still bent on this sort of conquest. And he wanted to invade the main universe, Azeroth. History ultimately repeated itself, and then as the Iron Horde succumbed to the Burning Legion's will before being defeated by the forces of Azeroth, the uncorrupted remains of the Iron Horde subsequently renamed themselves the Mag'har. So years later, these uncorrupted orcs who were recruited into Azeroth's horde joined their main universe brethren. So like, no matter how he tried to change the future from the past, it just didn't happen. The events occurred like they naturally would have anyway, and the orcs and Mag'har eventually they're obviously together because the Mag'har are now an allied clan that you can play as. If you want to get into like the origins and the early histories, we can trace our language back to Grond, who was this enormous stone giant created by Titans, which was Agrimar. Agrimar we fought in Antorus, and he made the Grond to defeat the Evergrowth, and these plant like, was it the spore mounds of all ancient Draenor? Think of the big botanical looking dudes, look like brontosauruses almost, that are in Sporgar down in Zangarmarsh. And as the Grond and the spore mounds fought, pieces of the battle of these leviathans kind of fell to the earth and gave rise to what we know as the Colossals, which were the children of Grond. And then they had the Genosaurs, which were the children of the spore mounds. And after Grond's death, these Colossals continued fighting the spore mound Patan and its minions, but over many of the stone giants succumbed to their foes, and all the Colossals' remains new creatures known as Magmaron emerged. Okay. They and the Colossus kind of sacrificed themselves, only to destroy the Batant in this massive explosion. And so spores from the plant body, teaming up with the spirit of life, drifted back to Draenor's surface, and then clung to the hides of Magmaron, weakening their bodies and turning them into flesh. Some of the Magmaron devolved into beings called the Grand. Not to be confused with Grand. And then due to the Ogron, you know, which are the guys like the twin Ogron over in I always forget the name of that dungeon, that raid. High Mall. There we go. So over thousands of years, these residual spores transformed a number of Ogron into the ogre race, from whom arises yet another race. Right? There's another offshoot of ogres, who were an offshoot of the Grands, who were an offshoot of eventually going back to Grand. This final straw, last of evolution, the Orcs. Right. They are the smallest and the weakest of the Grand line, but the Orcs made up for what they lacked in size and strength with a fierce intellect. And they kind of had a sense of community, if you will. They were the first really civilized and higher intellect, more sentient of beings of that line, of that watering down over the millennia. By banding together, they survived the harsh wilds. By the time that the Ericon and their little Apex, well, the Ericoans, the bird people, and their little Apex's empire fell, that was still 1,200 years before the opening of the Dark Portal. The Children of Stone had grown in number and spread across the entirety of the land, but the ogres and orcs quickly learned that the fear of the Ogron's attention. And then the orcs slayed far away from Orgron, their entire lands. The largest orc settlement at the time was this massive cave network beneath Gorgrond. Even though it was a bountiful region, orcs preferred life of freedom in meager conditions over suffering as slaves to the Orgon. Ogron? I always mess that up. I couldn't tell you. Now, that brings us back to the formation of orc clans. Okay? Now, Archmage Khadgar, that we all know, and either love or hate, depending on how you feel about him, he said at one time that, and I can quote it, it says, "From what I've heard, before they formed the Horde, the orcs were apparently no more hostile than any other life on Draenor, which is to say, they were quite hostile indeed." End quote. You gotta think of the tranquility that you really live amongst an Azeroth. We have your typical Earth simulated place. You have your bears and your spiders, but you have a very other few not so threatening races. So when the ogres revolted against their Ogron masters, the hierarchy of survival of Draenor was drastically, and I mean drastically, altered. The two greatest threats to Gorgon's eyes, the Gran and the Ogron, but they were both eliminated. And by the time the 800 years before the Dark Portal happened, the orcs that were no longer confined to their underground caverns kind of started forging these permanent settlements on Draenor's surface, and for the first time in generations, they are above ground. The orc population exploded, and because of overpopulation and lack of prey to hunt, it became a serious issue. So the tensions between the families kind of simmered, right? They kind of pulled together a little bit. But that was before war erupted. Many orcs migrated out of Gorgrond because they were bleeding to dry with their need for food and hunting and everything else. And then they went to the new lands to settle. Those who remained in Gorgrond had a couple different clans. That's where the Blackrock clan comes from. That's where the Laughing Skull comes from. That's where Lightning's Blade comes from. That's where Dragon Maw comes from. And then you have the rest that moved themselves drawn to the Tanan jungle, and they were adopted a savage, superstitious mindset. That's where all that came from the Orcs. Was moving from Gorgron to Tanan. Because Gorgron, if you think about it, Gorgron was their native area in which they were started. Super thirsty today. My bad. So if we look into the ones who migrated east, with being superstitious as they were, they kind of kept their sanity, and one of them became the Bleeding Hollow clan. And then there was the ones that lost themselves with these dark impulses, and they were kind of exiled over the time, that they were, formed together. Smaller known as the Bone Chewers. Gives you a slight indication of what made them so crazy. The Orcs who journeyed west of Gorgon, they went over to Frostfire Ridge, and these ones hold a very dear and near place in my heart. That's where you had the Frost Wolves and the White Claws, and they learned to adapt to their environment, while the Thunderlord clan, they kind of instead sought to dominate the land to the south. And the three clans that settled into the mountains and the plains and the fertile Talador, those was the Burning Blade, the Red Walkers, and the Blade Winds. And then you have the Warsong, right? Warsong clan migrated farther southwest and roamed the plains of Nagrand, a second favorite. Then to the southeast, you have the Shadowmoon clan formed over in Shadowmoon Valley. That's literally all of them. But in all of those cultures, you still have these very real beliefs. They still had their shamanistic training. So mystics from the Shadowmoon clan, they would usually go across the world of they would go on these little pilgrimages, hoping to hear the will of the divine, if you will. And then many of these travelers even received strange dreams and visions near the mountains of northwestern Nagrand, which, unbeknownst to the Orcs, was the final resting place, of Grand, believe it or not. And then it was a place that was infused with these huge elemental energies. The first Shadowmoon visitors to the location kind of learned about the world's primordial spirits, like, fire, air, earth, and water. They treated the beings with the utmost respect and named them the site of their discovery. They, that's what if we're over that, they call that little area the Throne of the Elements. Orcs flocked to Grand's remains and learned to guide the elemental spirits with a sense of harmony, and in return receiving these astonishing powers like any seen before the Orcs. The Shadowmoon clan were the first to dedicate themselves to the elements and transform Grand's head into a crude temple. They soon began spreading their teachings and their to the other clans, nearly all of which adopted the practice. So you have young Orcs who were raised to the steadfast allies of elements, which adopted the practice. The young Orcs, to the kind of they would practice them to be raised almost steadfast to the elements. As a fledgling, shaman traveled to the Throne of Elements to seek a spiritual blessing, the fledgling shaman traveled to the Throne of Elements as well. However, during the process of the few Orcs glimpsed into the realm of the void, and what they saw drove them simply and quickly insane. Imagine seeing something that turns you instantly crazy. That's, that's a horrifying thought. You would never think of something like that. So during the process, when these few Orcs glimmered, they could kind of take a glimpse on the realm of the void, what they saw drove them nuts, of course, but it led them to being exiled from their clans and forced them into the seclusion of caves beneath the Grand again. White skulls were tattooed on their faces, marking them as dead to their people. Those Orcs were welcomed by the elements, returned, with a bond between shaman and cross-clan boundaries, allowing them to peacefully solve conflicts. And in the Shadowmoon clan, they started, they began this biannual gathering called the Kosh Harg Festival. Initially only a gathering for shaman, but it soon grew to be all orcs. Which is, hey, it's whatever. So for generations, as the orcs lived on the fringes of the Gorian Empire, which is, the ogres, engaged in the occasional territorial disputes, but never really committing to an all-out war against the ogres. The Gorian had little interest, or, maybe they were afraid a little bit, that the orcs saw the practice of shamanism as little more than a quaint trickery. But when they witnessed the power of the shaman, first they decided to take the power by force. Then you jump ahead 403 years before the Dark Portal, where Imperator Moloch sent an army to drive away the rest of the orcs from the Throne of Elements and begin experimenting on the powers that were there. One day, with dissonance between the ogre's magic and, the residual emerging lingers in the remains of Grand, from those, from whose head that the throne of elements had been formed, it caused an explosion and blew apart the Orcish temple on sight. The incident itself kind of threw the elements out of balance across Draenor, causing great storms. But Moloch, good old Imperator Moloch, the crazy power drunk ogre that we've already killed back in Highmaul, he simply sent more spellcasters to replace the ones that had been killed by the explosion. So he obviously had an unstoppable amount of resources for troops. After that happened, right, the following year, when Kosh Harg Festival happened again, the elder shaman of the Shadow Moon, Nelgarm, he pleaded for action. He said less of all the clans suffered disastrous famines as a result of the elements' imbalance. The clans agreed to join together, and Nelgarm called upon the elements to bless them with their protection. The united army of the orcs took back the Throne of Elements with minimal bloodshed, which is a huge thing. The ogres imagined that the merciless tactic would strike terror into the hearts of the orcs, but the clans kind of rose to the challenge, and in the small mobile groups, the raiders slowly dismantled the Gorian Empire. A network of fortresses and outposts and all that were kind of pushing the ogre armies back to their capital, which is Goria. The orcs kept their distance in the hills surrounding the city, content to starve their enemy completely out, and as the siege progressed and the ogres found maintaining their empire to be increasingly unsustainable, Moloch himself and his little sorcerers, they revisited the Apexis crystals, searching for a way to break up the siege. Being that they succeeded, and soon the so-called red pox spread like wildfire. Red pox, man. It's like the orcish smallpox. Just killing them left and right. If the orcs failed, and then the spirits unleashed their fury upon Goria, over hours, lightning, fire, and earthquakes ravaged the ogre capital until nothing but ash and rubble remained. Reminds me of Sodom and Gomorrah. Before the earth itself retched open like a giant maw to swallow Moloch and the remains of his great city whole. Literally Sodom and Gomorrah. So after Goria fell, there was only whispers, right? There was only whispers going around of this event that was going to take place. But those who were enough to discourage, further tampering with the elements, the orcs were the ones that came out on top. They had suffered massive losses, as everyone does in a warlike situation. There was a little argument, and the orc clans returned to their lands. The Gorian Empire, though it never recovered, the ogre outposts and fortresses gradually became more of, a skin to an individual city. that, that it kind of like a unified nation. And the orcs began to seize these ogre lands by force, gradually surpassing them in the most advanced dominant race in the world. That is until the arrival of the Draenei 200 years later. Okay. And I wanted to lay this out because this is as basic as it gets. Yeah. Next week we can go into talking about Goria. So we can go back into talking about the Grand. We can go talk about the Grand himself, or the Gran, or all the ogres. I mean, we did ogres already, but we can do the others just to kind of get an idea of the evolutionary path that got us to the orcs. But this right here was a 10th of the story. But going forward, every week we're going to tell a little bit more. We're going to start digging real deep. Once we hear a name consistently 2 or 3 times, we'll drive it home, learn all we can about it, and go from there. That being said, first and foremost, I hope everyone had an awesome holiday season in New Year's. I know we all had to, or at least we're supposed to, stay away from one another, not have big gatherings. I know some states had a limit. Don't do it for, was it 13 people or 11 people or something like that, and the typical COVID practice. That being aside, I hope everyone had a decent holiday for it. If you didn't go out for Christmas or didn't have family go out for Christmas, I hope you at least went outside or had somewhere to go in your car to watch the fireworks or have a beverage or do whatever you had to do. But now that we're in January of the new year, I can let everyone know here, those who didn't see my posts on social medias, the real world work schedule has been changed, right? So now I'm working Wednesday through Saturdays. What we're trying to do, we're getting in the groove, the wife and I with the kid. I'm trying to etch out a legitimate schedule. So aside from the technical difficulties we had about getting this done yesterday versus today, with the design team having to tweak some artwork, we got it all lined up now. But going forward, I'm bringing the shows to a different day of the week. Typically, they will be Mondays at noon, aside from today again, and I apologize for that, but noon. Mondays, I'm going to start putting it on. The day we do the stream is the day I'm going to flip it, edit it, send it back out to the webverse with YouTube, post it on Instagram, post it where I can, start cross-promoting, and let's just get everyone educated and informed and love the game that we all love to play so much. You know what I mean? I think we deserve at least that. Going into 2021, however, is a whole different story. But all we can do is wait and see what happens, right? But I hope the case is that we don't have that bad of a deal. I hope something happens where we still get to keep our virtues and our freedom, but you never know. But next week, we're going to dive into the more of the Outland lore, right? We're going to see where we came from, and we're going to see where we're going. We're going to give some ideas of names that have really been a big deal. Places we've ourselves have walked through and quested and have been for some time. But let's learn a little more about it together. You know what I mean? I don't know. I think it's a good idea. I hope everyone, if let me put this out there too. If anybody has any suggestions about this little multi-week story, send me a message. My DMs are all open on the socials. You can always feel free, completely free, to message the Barons Chat Podcast at gmail.com for any suggestions or things you want me to cover into the next episode, or things about orcs that you want me to cover in general. Because I think it'd be really interesting to see what people come up with, see what things people really don't know, and then we'll all figure them out. But I appreciate you stopping by. They call me Ziggy Salvation. I also have a channel of my own. You can stop by, say hello, drop a follow if you wish. If not, that's okay too. I hope everyone has a wonderful day, has a wonderful night. Take care.